Bozeman was founded in 1864 as a gold rush town. The gold rush wasn't here. It was farther to the southwest around Virginia City. But all those gold miners, the last thing they wanted to do was prepare their own food. So the Gallatin Valley here was a rich, and remains, a rich agricultural valley. So settlers moved here to raise beef and wheat to sell to the gold miners. And so Bozeman began as an agricultural town with a guaranteed, at least in the early years, a guaranteed market about 50 miles to the southwest and also towards Helena. And so it was feeding miners and feeding the people who worked with the miners. It was probably like thousands of towns in the American West. Transportation was slow. It was by horse-pulled vehicles, stagecoaches, freight wagons, or oxen-pulled freight wagons. And the goods, whether it was building materials or consumer goods or food supplies, were very expensive to move, to transport. So a lot was, if it couldn't be obtained locally, grown or acquired locally, some could be brought in at great distance at great cost. But for the most part, people had to rely on local sources of everything from wood to food, live without certain consumer goods, say big musical instruments, a piano. You could get it, but it would be expensive and difficult. And so for the first 2 decades of Bozeman's existence, from 1864 to 1883, there was no railroad. And so people did rely on animal-pulled transportation. And then in 1883, the main line of the Northern Pacific was built through here. It ran from St. Paul to Tacoma, Seattle. Several impacts. One obvious one was that especially for east-west travel, you could move much more quickly towards the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, eastern Montana, Glendive and Miles City, west towards Helena, Missoula, Spokane, Seattle. So that would be not only people moving, but mail and express, those consumer goods, maybe even luxuries that were manufactured in the east then had been very expensive to move to Montana either by freight wagon or steamboat to northern Montana, now could be brought here in a much quicker time at a greatly reduced cost. And probably the railroads, and this would be true in many places, people who wouldn't have moved here without the railroad, who wouldn't have wanted to spend 2 months on a steamboat or acquire a covered wagon and handle animals. Now they would consider moving here if it could be done in a week by train. So you had more people moving in to the territory of Montana, and people, including people who were awaiting more transportation. In fact, Montana becomes a state in 1889, and one of the criteria for statehood is to have a certain minimum population, about 60,000. And until the railroad reached Montana, Montana didn't have that population. What railroads did to already existing towns like Bozeman is they tied them into a national system of commerce. Now, Bozeman had been part of that system before, but as I remarked before, it was slow, either by steamboat to northern Montana and wagon south, or wagon across the Central Plains, and it was expensive. So now with the railroad, a product could be made, a household product could be made cheaply, inexpensively, somewhere back east, and sold here inexpensively because the transportation had a low cost. And farmers and ranchers in Montana could now, instead of having a market that may have only been 40, 50 miles, because beyond that the cost of transportation overrode the potential or eliminated the potential profit, now farmers in the Gallatin Valley could ship grain to Minneapolis and still make money because the cost of shipping grain by railroad was so low. So it meant that Bozeman, or and this would be true of almost every town reached by a railway, was much more tied into the commerce of the nation. The impact was that towns grew rapidly. One of their hopes was, when the railroad was built westward across the Dakota Territory, was that line would come through their town, because the presence of that rail line through their town or on the edge of their town would be, if not a guarantee, it would greatly improve their chances for a future, for prosperity, for growth, for tying into this national network. A town that was bypassed because it was, say, it was on a hill, way up on a hill, and the railroad was down in the valley, or it was one valley away from the railway line, and some of these mining towns were bypassed, would find itself losing population, maybe even facing, if not complete abandonment, not having the growth. Until about a couple decades ago, almost every railroad main line and many branch lines had a telegraph pole line, a pole line with anywhere from 1 or 2 to 6 cross arms, and on each cross arm would be those glass insulators that people now keep on their, some part of their house, and then a wire for each, and each cross arm would have up to 10 of these wires. And so on a main line, you might have 50 wires running along the track. Some of those were telegraphed for railway operations, where trains would take siding to let another train go by. But most of the Western Union Telegraph Company had wires there, and what it meant, in some cases the telegraph reached places in Montana before the railway. So the first telegraph line into Montana came from the south, from Utah through southern Idaho. But what the railway brought, or what came literally with the railway, were these telegraph lines. And so what it meant is that if after the railway with the telegraph, and you went to the train station generally, and the agent who sold tickets was probably also a telegrapher, at least in small towns. And so you could be what was, for 100 years ago, as close to instant communications as was available. You had the equivalent of the internet in terms of rapid communications. Public transportation in the United States, especially outside of metropolitan urban corridors, whether that's New York to DC or Seattle to Portland and Eugene, Oregon, is that probably about 100 years ago in the 19-teens, there was the densest network of scheduled public transportation. Almost every railway line, main line, secondary line, branch line, had daily or daily except Sunday passenger trains. And so you could get from a town of 150 people in northeastern Montana to Bozeman or to Missoula if you're going to college, for instance. That town of 150 people in northeastern Montana, now it may have 50 people. There has not been scheduled passenger service, bus, train, or anything else for decades. So one thing is that America had this wonderful system of public transportation. You could get from almost anywhere on a rail line, and there was 250,000 miles of rail route in the United States, to almost anywhere else. Now, it might not have always been comfortable, especially the local train. It would, there might have involved 6 or 7 layovers for especially long trips, crossing a good portion of the country, but you could do it.